The cabin fell silent as three F-22 Raptor pilots, in full dress uniform, made their way down the narrow airplane aisle. Passengers watched in confusion as the officers stopped at row 12, where a disheveled man in a faded jacket sat with his young daughter. "Phantom 6, the lead pilot said, his voice carrying through the quiet cabin. "We heard you were aboard." With perfect synchronization, all three pilots raised their hands in salute to the bewildered man whose eyes suddenly filled with tears. No one had noticed him before. Now, everyone wondered, who exactly was this ordinary-looking single father in seat 12F? If this story touches your heart, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these incredible true stories of unsung heroes among us. David Mitchell clutched his 7-year-old daughter's hand as they boarded the crowded flight from Dallas to San Diego. His worn jeans and simple button-up shirt had seen better days, much like the man himself. At 38, the lines on his face told stories of hardship far beyond his years, the strain of raising Emma alone after his wife's death 3 years ago, the struggle to maintain their modest apartment on his disability checks, and the invisible wounds from his military service that still plagued him nightly. "Daddy, can I have the window seat?" Emma asked, her innocent excitement a stark contrast to the hollow exhaustion in her father's eyes. "Of course, sweetheart," David managed a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. This trip wasn't a vacation, it was necessity. His mother-in-law had fallen ill, and they needed to say goodbye. The plane tickets had consumed their emergency savings, but some things were worth more than money. As they settled into their seats, David noticed the subtle shift of the businessman beside him, the slight recoil, the judgmental glance at his worn appearance. David was used to it by now, the way people looked through him rather than at him. Once, he had commanded respect in the cockpit of an F-16, known by his call sign, Phantom 6, for his uncanny ability to appear out of nowhere in combat simulations. Now, he was invisible for entirely different reasons. The flight attendants moved efficiently through pre-flight checks, offering perfunctory smiles that never quite acknowledged him. When beverage service began, the attendant seemed to hesitate before serving him, as if his poverty might be contagious. David declined anyway. The $5 beverages were an unnecessary expense. Emma, oblivious to these subtle slights, pressed her nose against the window glass. "Look, Daddy. There are fighter jets down there." David peered over her shoulder. Indeed, 3 F-22 Raptors sat on the tarmac. A familiar ache swelled in his chest. Flying had been everything to him once, before the ambush, before the crash landing that saved his squadron but left him with a shattered leg and recurring trauma that eventually made civilian life nearly impossible. "Those are F-22s, sweetheart. The most advanced fighters in our fleet," he explained, momentarily transported back to a time when he spoke this language daily. The businessman beside them perked up. "You know planes?" he asked, the first words he directed at David. "I used to fly F-16s, David replied quietly, not wanting to invite further conversation or, worse, disbelief. The man nodded politely but clearly remained skeptical. David was used to that, too. Without the uniform, without the confident stride his uninjured body once possessed, people rarely believed he'd once been entrusted with multi-million-dollar aircraft and the lives of his fellow airmen. The plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the sky. As always happened during takeoff, David's mind flashed back to his final flight, the warning signals, the radio crackle, the split-second decision that saved his team but cost him everything else. He closed his eyes and focused on his breathing, the techniques his therapist had taught him to manage the anxiety that still ambushed him regularly. Emma squeezed his hand. "Are you thinking about Mommy?" she asked with a child's intuition. David opened his eyes and smiled at his daughter. "No, sweetheart, just remembering some old times." Halfway through the flight, Emma needed to use the restroom. As they waited in the narrow aisle, David noticed 3 men in Air Force dress uniforms seated in first class. He recognized the insignia of fighter pilots, but he didn't stare. That world wasn't his anymore. What David didn't realize was that the pilot seated nearest the aisle had noticed him too, or more specifically, had noticed the worn patch partially visible on David's old jacket. Though faded, the ghostly outline of an F-16 with the text, Phantom Squadron, could still be made out. As David and Emma returned to their seats, the pilot leaned over to his colleagues. A quick conversation ensued, followed by one of them using the in-flight phone to make a call. 20 minutes later, a flight attendant approached David's row. "Sir," she said with newfound respect, "the gentleman in first class would like to speak with you, if you wouldn't mind." Confused, David looked at Emma. "Do you want to come with me, or stay here?" "I'll come," she said, always eager for adventure. The passengers watched curiously as the shabby-looking man and his daughter were escorted to first class, where 3 imposing officers waited. "Are you David Mitchell?" asked the oldest of the 3, a lieutenant colonel with salt and pepper hair. David straightened instinctively. "Yes, sir." "Phantom 6?" David's heart skipped a beat at hearing his call sign after so many years. "Yes, sir. Though it's been a long time since anyone's called me that." The lieutenant colonel extended his hand. "Colonel James Hartman. These are Majors Peterson and Williams. We were just deployed from Luke Air Force Base." David shook their hands, confusion evident on his face. "How did you know?" "Your jacket," said Major Peterson with a smile. "But more than that, your name. You're something of a legend in training circles, Mitchell. They still teach your Kandahar maneuver at the academy." Emma tugged at David's sleeve. "Daddy, what are they talking about?" Colonel Hartman knelt to Emma's level. "Your dad is a hero, young lady. He saved 6 other pilots during an ambush over Afghanistan. Flew his damaged aircraft in a way that shouldn't have been possible." David felt his cheeks flush. "I was just doing my job, sir." "That's not how the Air Force sees it," said Colonel Hartman, standing again. "We've been trying to locate you for the anniversary ceremony next month. You disappeared from our radar after medical discharge." David looked away. Life got complicated. Understanding passed between the men, the unspoken brotherhood of those who'd seen combat. "We'd like to invite you and your daughter to be our guests at the ceremony. All expenses paid. The Secretary of the Air Force will be there." Before David could respond, Colonel Hartman added, "And there's something else. The program for veteran pilots transitioning to civilian roles has been expanded. There's a position as a flight instructor that would suit someone with your experience. Full benefits, flexible schedule." David stood speechless, feeling the eyes of the entire first-class cabin upon him. "Daddy, are you going to fly again?" Emma asked, excitement bubbling in her voice. The colonel smiled. "Not combat missions, but teaching the next generation. And more importantly, a steady career with people who understand what you've been through." The emotion building in David's chest threatened to overflow. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes, Daddy," Emma urged. For the first time in years, David felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for Emma's future. "Yes," he said quietly. "Thank you." As they returned to their seats, Colonel Hartman stopped the flight attendant. "When we land, we'd like to make an announcement, if that's all right." When the plane touched down in San Diego, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we deplane, I've been informed that we have the honor of having a distinguished veteran on board with us today." David froze as the captain continued. "Former Captain David Mitchell, call sign Phantom 6, is the recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in saving his entire squadron during a critical mission. Today, he's been recognized by current Air Force officers who would like to pay their respects." The 3 officers stood in the aisle, and in perfect unison, rendered a formal salute to the man in seat 12F, the man most passengers had overlooked or dismissed. "We salute you, Phantom 6, announced Colonel Hartman loudly. The cabin erupted in applause. The businessman who had recoiled earlier now looked at David with newfound respect. The flight attendants who had barely noticed him now smiled warmly. Emma beamed up at her father, pride shining in her eyes. "See, Daddy? I always told you you're a hero." David embraced his daughter, tears flowing freely now. For years, he had felt forgotten, by his country, by society, by everyone except the little girl who depended on him. In that moment, surrounded by the applause of strangers and the recognition of his peers, David realized that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not in the skies above foreign lands, but in the quiet determination to keep going when everything seems lost. As passengers deplaned, many stopped to shake David's hand or thank him for his service. The 3 officers waited at the gate, ready to escort David and Emma to their connecting transportation. "Ready for your next mission, Phantom 6?" Colonel Hartman asked with a smile. David looked down at Emma, then back at the officers who had changed the trajectory of his life with a simple act of recognition. "Ready as I'll ever be, sir." Sometimes, heroes don't wear capes or even uniforms. Sometimes, they sit quietly among us in seat 12F, their greatest battles fought not in distant skies but in the daily struggle to provide for those they love. And sometimes, all it takes is for someone to remember their call sign, to truly see them, for everything to change. In the months that followed, David thrived as an instructor, his expertise valued and his schedule allowing him to be there for Emma. The military community embraced them both, becoming the extended family they had lacked. The poor single dad from seat 12F had finally found his way home. Remember, behind every stranger is a story we may never know unless we take the time to listen. In our busy world, it's easy to overlook those who might be quietly carrying burdens or honors we can't see. Perhaps the greatest lesson from David's story is that recognition and respect cost nothing to give, but can mean everything to receive.